to the first ever Pastors Podcast. That's the name we landed on, right, fellas?
Creative genius.
I think we went back and forth for a long time and just landed on Pastors Podcast. We should have some Greek word or something like that to really make it, but we didn't.
Like Pneuma. Like the Pneuma podcast. But
that was already taken.
Someone took that, I'm sure.
And did that a lot better than
did
us.
it really, really well. That would be a joke.
It's like us covering a Whitney Houston song. You just don't want to go there.
Or a new Ghostbusters movie 20 years later. Something like that.
So welcome to the Pastors Podcast. Great to have you with us. We are going to take a few minutes, introduce ourselves, share our heart, why we're even doing this. Listen, there's a lot of podcasts out there. This is going to be niche in nature in that this is for pastors, those that are on staff at a church. Like, we want to sit and have a conversation with you. We'll talk about our heart for that or why we're doing that. But first, I think it would be important to maybe just introduce ourselves and kind of talk through a little bit about who we are, our story, what our heart is, and what we're trying to accomplish. I could say this: we all have a deep, deep passion for the church. All three of us are senior pastors, lead pastors, and have a deep passion for the church, believe deeply in the role of the church in the life of a believer, in the role of the church in the life of a city and a nation, a deep conviction that revival, the vehicle through which revival flows, is the church. And so we'll talk through all that. But first, I'll tell a little of my story. But I'm Benny Liebscher. I'm the lead pastor of Jesus Culture, both the church here in the Sacramento region, as well as what we would call the movement that many people would know all over the world. And joined by
Phil Manginelli. I am the lead pastor of The Square in Atlanta, Georgia.
In a suburb. Now, we're Jesus Culture Sacramento, but we're actually in a suburb called Folsom. You're in a suburb of Atlanta.
Right, called Smyrna.
Which every time they say Smyrna, which I didn't know was one of the churches in Revelation, but every time they say Smyrna, it sounds like Dr. Seuss.
It totally does.
Atlanta has the most Dr. Seuss cities, in my opinion, when you talk about Smyrna and then Snellville.
Yep.
There's a Snellville.
I want to plant a church in Snellville.
And you got to follow it up with Butts County. So we're rolling in great names.
Every time I think of Snellville, I just think of the prayer meetings where we're calling out to God that he would visit Snellville. Give us Snellville, God.
Remember the revival of Snellville back in the...
That's it. So we're going to get to you, but first, how long have you been, did you plant the church?
Yes, yep.
And how long have you been senior pastoring that church?
Yeah, so Emily and I moved to Smyrna in December of 2012 and began the process of planting the church. And it was a little while before a church was there and in kind of movement. So we've been really pastoring it since 2013.
Out of us three, Phil is the only one that's an actual legitimate church planter. Because your story, you came with a whole bunch of young adults from a young adult ministry you'd been doing, so you just moved over a crew to start the church. I came with a whole crew and world famous worship leaders and staff and all that type of stuff. So I actually think that Phil's the only legitimate church planter in this podcast who actually started with nothing, got some people saved in his living room, started in their garage. He's got that story which he'll share. And so, am I allowed to say that for you, Nate?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yes. Yeah. Done. So, it's great. And how long have you been in pastoral ministry?
Yeah, I've been in pastoral ministry since 2003.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. And then also with us,
Nate Edwardson. My wife and I planted the Stirring Church in Redding, California. And yes, there's another
about that.
Church in Redding, yes, called the Stirring.
You were just on our other podcast, and I was chuckling because legitimately people that love Bethel that you meet around the world, they're probably thinking like, you have a church. There's another church in Redding, one, but you don't go to Bethel? I pastor a church. It doesn't matter. Why would you not go to Bethel?
Yeah, anywhere I go, any city, any nation that I visit, people find out we're from Redding, and they're like, "You go to Bethel, right?" And we go, "No, I actually started a church down the street." They're like, "You still go to Bethel, right?" And I'm like, "No, you're a Bethel campus." Like, no.
Why would you do that?
There's another church in Redding.
Why would you do that?
No, I get that look, and then suddenly they disregard anything I would potentially say.
And how long have you been in pastoral ministry?
Yeah, so 20 years now, which is a real fun story about just how we encountered Jesus and began to do ministry in that city. But 13 years ago, we planted the Stirring Church.
And you're the only one that's a pastor's kid too, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're the only pastor's kid that your dad was a pastor and had a successful church.
Yeah, I did. He pastored in Redding for about 25 years. And I vowed that I would never pastor.
Yeah.
Spent years partying, running from God, and at 22 just had this radical encounter with him. And actually it was kind of a unique move of God in our city.
Yeah, we'll talk about that because when I was actually youth pastoring. Have I told you this, Phil? I was youth pastoring in Redding, and he had started something called Celebration, which was full on, like a ton of young adults worship, this incredible move, but a ton of our high schoolers, more the older high school, those junior seniors, just started going to his thing. I was so irritated. I was so happy. I was so irritated.
I feel the pain and the joy at the same time. Yes.
So we're going to take a second. I'm going to start with you, and we just kind of want to hear. What I'd like to hear is just quickly your journey into church planting, but also kind of your heart for even doing this podcast. I don't know if I can stress this enough. There are so many podcasts out there, which I'm really grateful for, and I think it's awesome. But we really actually feel a call and a mandate to come alongside those that are working in the church context, encourage them, believe in them, and we'll talk about the unique nature of what they're doing. But here's why I want to start with you is we actually have recorded this already. We were going to launch the Pastor's Podcast a year ago, maybe. I don't even know how long ago it was now with the shutdown. I'm like, everything's blurred together. And we sat down and recorded, and I asked you to share your story. I'm not even going to be able to do this justice in my Phil. We laughed on this first one. I wish we could go find that.
I wish
we laughed for 10 minutes because
so fun.
Was it over? It was over. It was on Zoom too, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But I said, Nate, can you share your story? And I think the sentence was, well, it started 100 years ago on the docks of Norway.
Yes, it did.
And we thought you were kidding.
No, that's the thing. It took me a while to realize that Nate wasn't joking.
Nate wasn't joking.
You guys
Nate
just laughed
literally
at me.
started his story out. It started 100 years ago on the docks of Norway.
It's where my story starts. 100 years ago on the docks of Norway. Great grandfather Hildvig.
This is so amazing. Listen, can I just tell everybody?
Come on.
Is that really his name? No, what was his name?
Harold.
No,
But he married Hildvig.
Yes, I just want to say
Harold
this.
and Hildvig.
If you don't, as a pastor, if you don't have a friend in your life that when you ask them to tell you a story, they back up 100 years, you have a significant friend missing from your life.
Yeah, you do.
It started 100 years ago on the docks of Norway. With my great-great-grandfather. Okay, so we do want to know this.
It was so beautiful too.
It was actually.
I'll tell the story one day.
But literally, and I don't know. Maybe it was the way you phrased it because
it was the way you phrased it.
There was something in it where I was convinced you were joking, and so
we thought you were trying to be the funny guy.
I felt free to just like, oh my gosh, that's really funny.
So here's the question I have for you. Can you, for all those listening, you planted a church 13 years ago. Senior pastor in Redding. Can you tell the quicker journey of how you got into that?
Absolutely. So 20 years ago, was a part.
It started 100 years ago. You have to
You
now
said the quicker journey.
You now at least have to tell us. I agree with that. Just very quickly tell why you said it started 100 years ago in Norway on the docks.
So what happened 100 years ago on the docks? Oh, come on.
That's so good.
So my grandfather had an encounter with Jesus, and it was the first in our family.
Yeah.
He had come to a place where he was about to move and catch a ship out of Norway. He was on the docks. There were some worshipers from the Salvation Army who had experienced some revival. So a young girl walks over to my great-grandfather and says, "Do you know Jesus?" And he says, "No." She said, "Do you want to know Jesus?" My great-grandfather says, "No." He goes home, shuts the door in his bedroom, and in that alone moment, he says the Holy Spirit just flooded the room. He fell on his knees, and he gave his life to Jesus. And that was the beginning of our heritage.
Yeah. Now imagine that
amazing.
Story after we were laughing for 10 minutes and he tells the real story. We're like, okay, that's powerful.
Yeah,
and
I'm
I
a
feel bad for
terrible
laughing now. Okay.
So 80 years later.
80 years
84
later.
generations later.
Here we go.
So 22 years old, after years of partying, kind of running from God and the church, have this encounter with Jesus. And 7 of us gathered at my dad's church in Reading. And we prayed and God came. The next week, we showed up again on a Sunday night and we prayed and God came. Within a year, there were 700 to 800 young adults coming out from
And teenagers.
And teenagers.
And a few
from,
teenagers in there.
from
Incredible.
50 different churches. It definitely created some tension in town. We weren't trying to start a youth group. It was the move of God.
Yeah, it really was.
And-
it was powerful. It really
beautiful.
was a significant moment.
And our heart was to partner with churches across the city. And so after about 3 years, I share that because a man named Bill Randall, who became a real spiritual father to me, a pastor in our city, came alongside in a season where I was battling some discouragement. This worship night that we started kind of fell apart. I didn't know back then, I didn't have the maturity to know like some things have to die for God to give birth to the new thing. And so Bill began mentoring me, he began discipling me. And, that's where I really got a passion for church planting. He had just such a dream to raise up planters and start new churches and new paradigms. And so as that grew, God grows the vision in you and he grows you into the vision. And over years, about 5 years later, we ended up planting a church in Reading. Some beautiful stories around why we planted in Reading and just getting the word of the Lord and going after a generation that at some point we'll tackle in this podcast. But it's been a beautiful journey. I never thought I would pastor a church. But the thought of this podcast and coming alongside pastors and leaders in the same way that Bill came alongside me in that season and really helped develop me and grow me. I just really believe in the power of friendship. I believe in the courage that we get running with each other, the vision, the things we see. I could say Banning and Phil, I would not be the pastor, the leader that I am without just pastors and leaders and really friends in my life. So I highly value the privilege of being able to be a part of this kind of podcast.
And you would say that, our heart to do what Bill did for you, but also the continued voice of Bill and others in your life, like you said,
right.
that are just encouraging you along the way.
That's right.
All right, Phil, what is your story of getting into senior pastor?
Yeah. I think
Started 100 years ago.
Yeah. I actually do have some
In the
really...
sands of the Sahara. That's what I say.
stories.
Started 100
That's right.
years ago in the sands of the Sahara.
Because it was actually about 100 years ago.
No, they were laughing at me.
I don't even know my Italy.
Fleeing Mussolini to come to America for freedom. It's actually, so anyways, we should have some family
Trying
stories.
to compete.
The
This is what
immigration
happened.
of
no.
Italy.
Yeah.
Hey, you got a story, I got a story.
Yeah. I think I grew up in a family that really loved God, and I'm really grateful for that. I have remarkable parents, and so faith was just a part of my life. I had a very, honestly, as a child, I had a very innocent, childlike, love and obsession for God. It was very real in my life.
Wow.
And I kind of walked through typical adolescence. I think what a lot of people experience, competing desires. I was, as much as I wanted to love and follow Jesus, I wanted to do my own thing. I wanted to be popular. I wasn't. I wanted girls to like me. They often didn't. I was wrestling through significant sexual struggles and addiction in my life, and all of those things converge. And then when I was 16, my best friend drowned in a cliff diving accident. It was a very significant moment in my life. And it's hard to describe, but really what ended up happening is there's just a significant part of me that went numb. And that tension of wanting to continue to follow Jesus just kind of died in that pain in my life. And so it just started me on a prodigal season and a prodigal journey, which several years later in college, I had just at this really low point in my life, I had a pretty profound encounter with grace and the Father heart of God, and it kind of redirected my story. And
Did you know you want to be a pastor then?
it was interesting because as a kid, I knew I wanted to be a pastor. But when you walk away, you feel like you lose those
So
things.
you're the only one in this group that you kind of felt from a young age it's what you wanted to do?
Yeah, I mean, I remember distinct moments at 8, 9, 10, just this sense, you just have this sense you want to serve God with your life. And I think for me, in some ways, I would admit maybe the only paradigm I knew for that was pastoral ministry. Mm-hmm. But I think there was an undeniable thing inside me. And then you walk away and you sin a lot and you're so full of shame. You don't know where all of those things come back together. And even when I came back to Christ in college, it wasn't like this instantaneous, I want to go back into ministries. Really, it was, I just want to get my life together. I remember thinking somehow in California, I had built around me a community that wanted nothing to do with Jesus. And if I wanted my life to change, I was going to have to leave. And so I did. And that's when I went and joined an organization called YWAM, which stands for Youth with a Mission, and my life instantly changed. I mean, this experience, it's like I woke up to my true self. Years that I thought had been left for dead had come back, and God really met me there. It's where I met my wife. It's where my first time I stopped. I mean, I really first time in a long time that I had stopped lying, that I was my full self. I wasn't trying to hide. I was honest with my struggles and my story, and there was just this radical encounter with God. And I remember the reason that it's significant because so I spent some time on the mission field, and I was living and working in a UN refugee camp outside of Myanmar. And I'm there, and
Phil's
I'm working.
got those
I know.
stories.
Yeah. And so I'm here.
Working at a refugee
No
camp.
big deal.
And it's just this remarkable season in my life where I'm working with this group of people called the Karen. It's spelled like Karen, but it's like a displaced people group between Thailand and Myanmar. And working in this Christian community, like working in this orphanage, and I found myself on the mission field working with these incredible opportunities, and my heart just ached for my own people. And that's all, at that time, that's all I could understand. Like I was burdened for my own people. And so I ended up coming back home to the United States off of the mission field. Emily and I get married. And I was still honestly working through some bitterness in my own life, not towards Christ, but I had some painful church experiences as a child, which are stories we can get into later.
I'm going to tell you right now, Nate, the only reason I have Phil on this podcast is not because he's a good pastor, but because he has the absolute best Pentecostal youth Idaho stories you've ever heard.
Oh, come on.
They're unreal. I'm going to make you share at least one probably today. They're unreal. And listen, we're Pentecostals right now. I'm charismatic.
Proud.
I am a proud Pentecostal. But he has the best Pentecostal youth Idaho camp retreat stories that the only reason I've invited him on. I'm sure he's got other good stuff to say, but we're just gonna pepper it in
That's
with
worth
these.
it.
It's worth it.
It's worth it.
It's like it's the comedy relief. It's gonna be the comedy relief.
So I remember flying back home from Thailand and telling God, like, I don't know what to do because I love you and I hate the church, and I don't know how to connect those two dots. And flash forward a few years, Emily and I are married, and we're beginning to take some steps forward, and we've gone to school now. We're in a school called Life Pacific for biblical studies, pastoral ministry, these things. And I'm still working through some inner stuff. And I'm actually in Portland, Oregon, at a bookstore called Powell's. And I find this book called Why Christianity Must Change or Die. And I remember opening up the book and it was really meaningful to me because I was in this place of some angst towards the church that I didn't know what to do with. And I'd had some God encounters, like God has in my life at random moments encountered me so severely in like a moment that it completely redirects my life. And there was just this sense inside of me that I was like maybe in one of those moments. So I remember pulling this book, I read this book, the author begins to describe everything that they've struggled with the church, and I feel like they're speaking my life. I suddenly have this rising of hope. And then the author begins to get into their answer, and in short, their answer is that Jesus isn't really who he says he is, and the problem with Christianity is that the Jesus isn't true and the Bible isn't true.
It went the other direction.
And it was like this rise of hope inside of me to suddenly this like crash of like, God, I thought you were going to meet me here. I need answers here. I'm angry.
Wow.
And right there, I was remember this tiny little corner of the bookstore of Powell's, and I just have this encounter with the Holy Spirit where he says, Phil, do not hand your generation over to men like this. And it's hard to describe, but it's like he just, in
Yeah.
that moment, he
It's a mandate.
took the bitterness off of my life.
Come on.
A love for the church was replaced instantaneously, and it's never gone away. And it really is the driving word of my life to not hand my generation over. And that shifted things. And so Emily and I got married. We were married. We were volunteer college pastors. We went back on the mission field for about a year. We ended up being youth pastors and college pastors in Seattle, which is where Banning and I met. And it was a significant season of our life. So much fruit. We grew up so much. We walked through hard things, And I remember it was early 2012, and we had been youth and college pastors for about 6 years. And really had experienced some amazing things. I was just spending some time in prayer in our
As
youth
good
chapel.
as what they experienced in Reading with the celebration?
No, not that good.
Okay.
That's amazing.
Kind of good.
Partially good. And I was spending time in prayer, and I remember just kind of had this picture form in my time of prayer of this long dinner table. And people were at the dinner table, but they were shadowy. And suddenly God brought Luke 15, the story of the prodigal son, to my mind. And I just heard the Holy Spirit say, Phil, you have younger brothers and sisters you have to go find. I'm sending you.
Yeah. Wow.
And it started a journey of just this ache in our heart for church planting. Lots of stories in between. My wife was born and raised in Atlanta. It's not why we moved back, but it's why it's been a significant part of our story. We felt like God was asking us to move to Atlanta and to plant a church. And so we did. In Christmas 2012, with our 2 kids, we packed up to Smyrna and we left our life.
Parachuted in.
And I remember that first season,
Wow.
we just basically asked the question, where are people who don't know Jesus?
Yeah.
And I remember I was in like multiple basketball leagues and a beer making class and softball league. I mean, literally, if you just my
Where are people who
life,
don't know Jesus?
my
In a
life
beer
was,
making class.
Where are people who don't know Jesus? And then we just started a Bible study in our living room, which over the last several years has
preached
become
a sermon
the
one
square.
time, Who is on Your Couch? Based around the story he told me one time about how he just had people on his couch in his living room getting saved. That's how he started the church. I came back to our church and I was like, who is on your couch? Who are the people on your couch? It's amazing. You mentioned a really great, really powerful story as well, Phil, but you mentioned you've been on the mission field, college, youth pastor, anything else you've done in the context of church ministry?
No, yeah, that's it.
And then what about you? You're a senior pastor. You worship pastor?
Yeah, so I was a worship pastor for 5 years.
Okay, and then young adult pastor, or were you were leading?
Worship and young adults.
Okay.
And I love worship. I learned to play the guitar at that worship night. So I learned piano, learned guitar. So as the thing unfolded, it's like, hey, we didn't have all kinds of musicians ready to jump in. It's like, hey, you got to learn an instrument. So I ended up leading worship for years, which I still love to this day. I like to think I'm a worship leader more than a lead pastor.
That's
but I'm a
every
lead pastor
vineyard pastor
But
ever.
you have such a great
Every
voice.
vineyard pastor
you had to have already known. I mean, I feel like you know whether you have a good enough voice to
You come
lead a
from a music
congregation.
I could, yeah, and maybe I can sing on one of these podcasts.
Yes,
No,
done.
you can't.
Listen, I'm actually
You have a great
convinced.
voice.
I'm
I
actually-
remember the day that God called me out from behind the guitar. And I led worship. And I remember at one point where I was sensing the call to preach. I was terrified to speak to people. And the Lord said, you're hiding behind the guitar. The calling, the thing you said yes to is now actually what you're hiding behind. And there was a real transition. And I just said, God, I don't want to do it. I don't want to preach. I love singing. I love being a worship leader. But the gift really was leadership. And there are far more talented and anointed worship leaders than me. And I knew God was, calling me out from behind the place of safety to really begin speaking and preaching. Man, that's a whole nother journey.
Yeah, we'll be having those conversations.
Wow, I remember the first time I preached, and I was a young adult pastor at Risen King in Reading, and
Another church in Reading.
Yeah,
Astounding.
I know. Exactly.
There's at least 3 that we know.
Exactly 3, maybe more. We'll
Yeah.
get to that. But I remember preaching this message to our young adult group. There were maybe 200 young adults in the room, and preached this message. I was really scared, but I took the risk. And halfway through the message, a whole row of young adults, they stand up, and these girls just walked out. So you're trying to preach through the tragedy of people walking out in your message. The truth was it was too long anyway, and they were catching their ride or something.
Yeah, totally.
But at the
It
end
was the Lord saying, wrap it up,
wrap
Nate,
it up.
wrap it
Wrap
up.
it up. But so what happened is
Gone too long.
my friend walks up to me because I'd led worship for years.
While you were preaching?
No, right after.
Oh, gotcha.
So I wrap up the message.
You'll put the hand on the back thing whenever somebody's
Listen.
talking too long.
I'm already feeling insecure. People have been walking out. I'm terrified to step into this moment of holy obedience. And my friend looks at me and says, "Hey man, you should stick to the guitar."
Oh,
That's the first. Listen, that's the first word I get after my first message is, "Hey, stick to the guitar, man." So in those moments, you have a decision to make. Like, am I going to listen to the voice of man or the voice of God? And years later, he's an encouraging friend. But that was one of those moments where I wanted to die.
Can I just say we need an entire podcast on what goes through your mind when people stand up and walk out of your service? My guess is 95% of them are going to the bathroom, but that's not what I think.
No, this is why also for the podcast right now, one of the reasons why I want to do a podcast for pastors, for people in church, in church roles, is because there are things we encounter that nobody else would fully understand. And one of them, whether it's the expectations of everybody wants you to do this or do that, and especially in the current climate, the current culture, like, but let alone the serious things like burnout and failure and all that. But one of them is when you're preaching and somebody gets up to leave.
We have to go there.
It's awful.
We've got to get so real in this podcast.
But we could, because that's like you're up there and you're preaching and everything's going, and you're right, they're probably going to the bathroom, but you're not thinking that at the moment.
Yeah.
No.
You're thinking this person hates me. They're officially leaving our church.
And listen, the intimacy of preaching.
Yes.
You've been in this word for days, maybe months, and so you're about to release this thing from heaven. You're not even to the good part. You know what I mean? Like you're not even to the climax, if I could call it that. The intimacy of this moment, and they walk out, and you're
can't
like,
call it that.
What?
Not in that
It feels like that. It feels like that.
I've never had a sermon that feels like that.
The last time I heard you preach, cops rushed into a stadium.
But continue with your analogy. But and all of a sudden they're leaving.
They're leaving. They're walking out, and it's like you thought it was a relationship here, and they're just and it's in the middle. So it's a real thing.
You're trying to not take it personal. They literally are probably going to get their kid out of the nursery, but you're like, don't take it personally. Don't take it personally. I'm not and maybe not everybody deals with it in their head like that. I don't know, but. Man.
Just us.
Just us.
No one's ever been insecure like we are.
But this is the conversations that somehow I'm not sure anybody else would have or know. So I, real quick, and then we'll actually just wrap up this podcast. We're going to be doing more of them. Our heart is, I want to quickly hear in just a few sentences, just what your heart is for pastors. And we want to be having conversations about church and about life and about culture and about health. Like we have a big passion for you to be healthy in your internal world, as well as bringing on other guests, pastors and leaders who can come and just kind of bring their contribution. For me, I grew up in church, very conservative Baptist environment. Went for a while after that to your dad's church, Nate. But grew up saved when I was little. Grew up conservative Baptist. High school wasn't like massive, fell away or party or anything, but just wasn't really serious about God. But then at 17, started going to Bethel Church. It was just before Bill was there, and just really got on fire, got involved in youth group, but knew that right when I started going, I had kind of a moment with the Lord one Sunday night in 1993, right before my senior year. But it was funny when I went forward and just said, God, I'm going to do this Christianity thing 100%. That night, to the best of my knowledge, I never had thought about ministry. That night, I went home and told my mom, I want to preach. That's what I want to do with my life. I want to preach, and changed everything. I was going to be a sports broadcaster. I was headed towards this thing. And so I want to preach, but pastoring was never on my radar.
Wow.
Like it wasn't on my radar at all. I was going to, I read a biography on Billy Graham, and a couple of itinerant speakers had come through and really impacted my life my senior year. So when I come out of my senior year, I go to college to get kind of a Bible degree so that I can go travel and preach. I just want to travel and preach. And I come back to Bethel to do an internship for college my sophomore year, and then they end up hiring me. But they hire me as associate youth pastor, when they come and ask me at 21 to be the youth pastor, I turned them down. Bill had come and they said, hey, would you be the youth pastor? I'm 21 years old. And I said, no. I kid you not, I said, I don't feel called to young people and I don't feel called to the local church. I just want to travel and preach.
So my wife tells stories about Banning.
Yeah.
In high school.
We went to school together.
So Erica says that in high school she would go to the Jesus Club.
I literally started a Christian club at the Christian high school.
Christian high school, Christian club. Here's what Erica says. Erica says at lunch she would go because she had a heart for God. And so she said I would go and it would be Banning and I, the only two in the room.
Yeah.
So Banning and my wife Erica, the only two in the room at lunchtime, Jesus Club, have a heart for God. And she said they would pray, and Banning would say over and over again, I'm going to fill stadiums one day. I'm going to fill stadiums. I feel called to preach.
17.
I'm going to fill 17 years
17.
old. That's my wife talking about Banning.
That's amazing.
And so I just want to, Billy Graham, and it was because of the book I read from Billy Graham. It just stirred my heart. Anyways, so when they come and say, will you be the youth pastor? I said, nope. I totally turned him down. And there was an opportunity for me to go. I wanted to go to a YWAM. Floyd McClung had like a mentoring school for young men that he then mentored and let them travel with him. So I was going to go be with him. I'd applied for the school. They hadn't gotten back to me yet. And so I thought they had turned me down. So I went back to Bill and said, all youth pastor. Literally did not feel called to youth, did not feel called to the church. It was just the door that was open in front of me. I'd met CJ at that time. We were dating. And so I said, yeah, I'll do it. And I was there I'd already been there 2 years on staff, but I was there for another 16 years after that. Yeah. But I was another 10 years. I youth pastored for a decade and then was at Bethel for another 6 years. So 18 years total. But during my time of youth pastoring, absolutely fell in love with people and fell in love with the local church.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I am not at my core, the pastoral kind of, I know we use the word pastor because that's just how we reference people.
Let's be honest, Phil's the only pastor at the table here right now.
Only
so
real
Pastor's
pastor.
Podcast, we have a real pastor with us.
A real five-fold pastor. But at my core, but I found a deep love for people.
Wow.
Found a deep love for the local church and really my burning passion for revival, kind of just seeing how the local church is just such a big part of that. And then, but here's the deal. Even in the midst of that, senior pastoring, not even on my radar at all.
Yeah.
And I don't know what we just thought we were doing Jesus culture. You know, we're all over the world doing Jesus culture and preaching but then, we'll tell the story later, but 2012, after a really, really tough year, got a phone call from a guy who had a really significant church that I go preach at every year. They love me there. There's a handful of places you go to that every time you go, it's like a home run, and people just love you. Best sermon you've ever done. It's one of those places. He called me and said, hey, would you be interested in coming to take our church? I was probably 35 at the time. And they just were looking for somebody that was a younger leader who could preach, who could take the church, and that just started. I was like, nah, I'm good. Like we're good. Like we're doing this thing, and I just couldn't shake it. And it started it's a longer story for us, but it just started stirring something in us. Man, I think it's time I think we're supposed to go. I thought maybe we'd take a church, but I think we're supposed to go and we're supposed to pastor. And so we did. We planted a church in 2014. We'll hit our 6-year anniversary in September 2020. And looking back now, I was pretty sober coming in, and we'll have these conversations because it's one thing. It's one thing to be an itinerant preacher. So it's one thing to preach. It's one thing to build a music label and a conference ministry and like that type of thing. It's an entirely other thing to actually lead a local community of people.
Yeah.
And so I was actually pretty sober about it. I was pretty sober going in because I'm like, it's a different ball game. But by far the 6 years of senior pastoring have easily been the most rewarding, fulfilling season of my life.
Yeah.
And it's been incredible for CJ and myself, both for CJ and me, both. Just so love our people, so love our church.
Wow.
And even right now, we have the movement side of things. And so still, things like this podcast, we have a call to encourage pastors and equip and build, and we do music and we do conferences and podcasts, all that stuff. but still, man, my heart just burns for our church. Even in the midst of this, somebody's asking me in the midst of COVID and all this. They're like, so are you thinking like how you're building your movement in this time? And I'm like, I just want to get our church through this. Here's my only goal.
Wow.
My only goal is that our church would come out the other side healthier and stronger.
Love it.
And if anybody in the world wants to come along for the ride, then let's do it. But yeah, so now been the lead senior pastor for 6 years. We planted differently too. We planted differently than Phil.
Sure.
We came with 7 world-class worship leaders, an entire staff, a budget, a name, like the whole thing. So ours was probably a little different story, but
that's amazing. One of the things I love that you said about you and CJ though, and Nate, I'd be interested to see what you would say about you and Erica, is Emily and I have always had this deep dream and desire to minister together. And that certainly happened in stages in our lives. But nothing like when we church planted. It activated a new oneness between us, that Emily and I genuinely are leading the square together. In a way, we always dreamed about leading ministry together, and we just never kind of were able to find our way. And that's been honestly one of the most incredible parts of doing this is Emily and I are legitimately doing it together.
CJ, 7 weeks in, came. And 7 weeks into our church plant came and said, "Hey, I'd like to preach on a Sunday." And I about fell over because we've been doing conferences around the world. This is not like we have been holding conferences, thousands of people all over the world. And every time we go somewhere, I'd be like, "CJ, you want to teach, or you want to do anything? You want to preach? Like whatever you want to do, like jump in and do. Like there's no holding, like no limitations." And she was like, "Nah, I'm good." And we get to the church, and she goes, "I'd like to teach." And I'm like, "What?" And I asked her afterwards, like, why do you all of a sudden want to teach now? And for her, she said, "Well, because these are our people. These are who we're doing life with." Now, I'm like, no, those people in Minneapolis, those 3,000 people that showed up in Minneapolis, those are our people too. Because I'm like, this is the global movement. Those are our people too. But for her, the connection
amazing.
of this is the community that we're going to be living life with.
Yeah.
I want to help lead and shape and be a part of that.
Yeah.
Where, listen, I'm still stoked about people that show up to, like, these are everybody's listening right now. She's all got her own podcast, and now she's doing stuff. But I'm like, everybody listening right now, you're our family, even though you live somewhere else. But for her, it was just a connection of this is who we're going to do life with. Wow. I want to be involved with this.
I love it.
All right, listen, as we kind of wrap up, and I guess we're just kind of inviting you in to this podcast. And if you know other pastors, if you know other staff members at church, again, it's going to be a niche. This isn't a widespread shotgun kind of approach. We are going to be talking about church and about pastoring and about culture,
people
and
walking
community.
out.
Yeah, people walking out. All that we're called to navigate right now.
Wow, that's right.
And we talked about this kind of our. We want pastors to have a healthy heart.
Yes.
We want pastors to be able to execute in their leadership.
Yes.
We want pastors to have theological clarity.
Yeah.
We want pastors to be connected in community and encouraged and inspired. Like, we want pastors to be intentional with the culture they're building. These are all our heart to come alongside people. But Nate, just real quick, if you were to give a synopsis, your heart for pastors, why you would invest any time or energy at all besides hanging out with us into this podcast.
Well, I would do it just to hang out with you for sure.
And that's worth it right there.
But I think as pastors, we've experienced things, and on the journey, we've come to realize how much we actually need each other. Like, I need people in my life. I didn't realize that early on.
Right.
But I really need friends. I think of the story of Jonathan and the armor bearer. To me, when I think of this podcast, I think of that moment where Jonathan has this dream. He's got this assignment to run with God. And there's that moment where he turns around to his armor bearer. It's like he hesitates for one moment. And it's that moment we all need, the courage that comes from running with others, with other pastors and leaders. And I think this, the armor bearer says, "Do all that's in your heart. I'm with you, heart and soul."
Yeah.
And that word, heart and soul, that people are with me in the journey, helping me walk into the fullness of my heart and be fulfilled to the depths of my soul, heart and soul. I think there's a courage that comes, on the journey. I also think that we face pain, And pain is normal. Pain happens. Life is difficult. Leadership can be lonely. And I think we've got to learn to face pain together. That pain can either isolate us or it can transform us.
Yeah.
The choice is ours. So I think there's a courage. I think there's facing pain. And there's just a joy. Yeah. There's a joy of being in it together. And I'm so privileged to be a part of a movement of pastors that want to actually do healthy family, healthy life, and build healthy church.
And I think part of what you're talking about too is coming alongside people who, I find it very odd as a pastor to somehow act like our job is harder than other people's jobs. It feels a little self-serving. It feels a little arrogant to say that, like, because there are people in our churches that are working hard, that carry weight, that the same thing. But there is something unique about pastoring that I don't think everybody would understand unless you've been in it. And not to be dramatic, I'm not trying to be dramatic or make a point right now, but whether it's everybody's expectation of what you should be doing, or whether it's that, we literally are trying to, raise our kid, and then we get a phone call about a baby that just died in the hospital, and we have to go up there and sit with this family who just went through the absolute worst nightmare scenario you've ever been through. We're sitting there with them, and then you've got, what's happening culturally, and you got to. I'm just saying, there's so much that we have to kind of navigate, and so I do think, although I do think it's a little self-serving sometimes to act like somehow what we do is heavier than what other people do, but just the nature of what we do, we are dealing with heavy things and expectations and trying to make the right decisions, and we're dealing with people's spiritual lives too. So like, I don't want to mess this up. Right. Like I want to be able to do this properly, and we're going to stand before God one day and answer for a few things. So I think just having people, when you talk about pain, even and even people wouldn't understand, like when people leave the church. Again, we talked about this in the regular Jesus Culture podcast. Like, people can leave, like Jesus can send people, but it's also like this really personal thing that you're trying not to take personal. It's this whole thing. So I just think that there are things that you just need people that are like, yeah, I get it, I understand it, and let's go walk through this in a healthy way. Yeah. Phil, your heart and passion for pastors and why you would do a podcast.
Well, I think it's fair to say, just in total alignment with Nate, just how much we need all of those things. And the one thing I would add to it is that I think we are living in a really unique time where there is this like generational crisis for us to find success in all of the wrong places. And I know this from my own life, and I certainly know it from walking with so many people, that this faulted framework that says I am successful. If I'm known, I'm successful. Yeah. If I get status, I'm successful, if I fill in the blank. And there is I believe that something we talk about all the time, success is obedience. And we have to come back to a place as pastors where we're functioning more out of genuine calling than we are out of like this false drive. And I would say that my hope is to actually create a place where, as pastors, we can do everything kind of that Nate spoke to that we deeply need, but we can have a safe place to also go, hey, there's this really broken part of me that I own. I want to see my church grow because I am madly in love with Jesus and want to see people saved. And I want to see my church grow because I love it when people think I'm great. And I have to figure out how to let Jesus make one part of my life flourish and continually come to the cross with the other part of my life and give him away to him. And so my hope is that we get a chance, as we really talk about the real stuff of pastoral ministry, that kind of exchange and whatever dynamic it is we get to create a space where that's what's happening in pastors' lives.
Come on.
And I also think in the midst of that, and this isn't a counter, but like, I want to laugh as well. It's even that thing, like when we just stop and go, when we really talk about what is going through our head as people are walking out to go to the bathroom. Yes. Like if we like to really be able to sit around and go like, yeah, totally. And people going like, oh my gosh, does that go through your head too? Absolutely. That's what goes through my head. I think for me, there's a couple things for me is I want to come alongside people and see them succeed. I just so believe deeply in people and the call that God has in our life. And if I can play any part at all, no matter how small, to somehow encourage people in their journey. And my passion for revival, I need pastors. I need pastors in cities around the world to be experiencing all that God has for them, if we're going to really see revival. But I would probably break down my passion into this story. When I was probably about, I started youth pastoring, the head youth pastor. I was associate youth pastor, but I was the head youth pastor when I was 21. A few years after that, and I, in over my head, have no idea what I'm doing. That's not like a romantic version of the story, like completely lost in what I'm supposed to be doing as a youth pastor, have no idea. Most of my prayer times were like, God, please show me how to not lose every leader I have, because I'm just losing every leader I have. I don't know how to grow a group. I don't know what I'm doing. Like, I just so far and over my head. And not long after that, a few years into that, still feeling that way, the Lord spoke to me one day and said, I want you to have a conference for youth pastors. And I just said, God, I can't have a conference for youth pastors. How am I supposed to have a conference for youth pastors? I don't know how. I can't tell them anything. Like, I don't know how to tell them how to grow a large group. I don't know how to tell them how to do anything. And the Lord spoke to me something that probably still is what marks me today. But he said, I don't need you to train them. I just need you to encourage them. He said, I just want you. He goes, I just want you to be their biggest fan. And I realized, I thought, I can bring other people in to train them. And I mean, we train and equip now. We're a little further down the road. But my core, I just want to encourage people. Yeah. I just felt like the Lord said, just encourage them. And so that's what we did. We started putting on a conference for youth pastors and their team. I'd bring other people in just to kind of do mainly the teaching and equipping. And I just thought, all I want to do is encourage you.
Wow.
I just want to speak life, encourage into you, into what you're doing. And I would still say to this day, like, I want to see you equipped. I want to see you inspired. I want to see you challenged. I want to see you healthy, but I want to see you encouraged. Wow. I want you to feel like I am encouraged in what I'm doing right now. And it's not even a reaction, because ministry can be discouraging. But that's my heart. And I think that would be your guys' heart as well. Yeah. But that's kind of why we would do what we're doing. And that's why I'm excited to say, hey, let's go on the journey together, And I think when Jesus Culture started, I was a youth pastor with some young people, a handful of youth leaders who were passionate about going after God. And we were in the trenches while we were beginning to host conferences and trainings and all that type of stuff. And I feel the same way right now.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm like, I don't know. We're just pastors trying to figure out how to lead church, how to build this stuff, how to reach a city, how to stay healthy, how to pastor people, how to equip teams. We're just in that mode. And at some level, if we can just say, come along and just say, hey, let's go all run together after this thing, Let's go see how we can do this. So that's really our heart. So, all right, well, a few things. One is, Phil, we're going to have to eventually, not this podcast, we're going to have to get into some Pentecostal.
Come on.
Pentecostal stories.
Pentecostal Idaho youth stories.
They're good.
And we're going to get into all this type of stuff. So, but thanks for joining us on our second take of our first podcast for Pastors Podcast. Really great to have you guys with us. And listen, are you guys any good? You're not even on social media, are you?
No, I might get back on.
But listen, what I say is this: do you answer DMs?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just saying, listen, if you're a pastor, reach out, say hi, let us know who you are, where you're from. I respond to them. I love saying hi to people and just connecting. So if you want to reach out to any of us and just say, hey, I was listening to the podcast, this is who I am, this is where I'm going, genuinely, I would love to hear and love to connect. So thanks for jumping on. We'll look forward to next time.